Welcome to Diaspora, the podcast exploring African cultures and people. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
I just want to start by giving you the opportunity to introduce yourself, and then after that, we can go over some of the few questions I have.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much, Professor Mary Nyangweso. My name is Professor Morris Hamtabi. I teach leadership and governance courses at the Tech University of Kenya. I had a chance to work with the other universities as a Vice Chancellor at Kenya University, Deputy Vice Chancellor at Kisii University, and a lecturer at Moi University, and a professor at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington State. I hold a PhD in African Studies from University of Illinois and a master's degree in the area of economic history of Africa from University of Nairobi, and a bachelor's degree in political science and history. I've had a chance to do a lot of research on Pan-Africanism and issues about Pan-Africanism, especially in terms of how Pan-Africanism played a very important role in the liberation of Africa. And I'm talking about the role of the diaspora in sensitizing and raising the consciousness of the African continent through Pan-Africanism. So I've had a chance to teach courses related to Pan-Africanism as a scholar in that area, and also one that has participated in writing articles in the celebration of some of the famous Pan-Africanists. And we talk about Pan-Africanism going back to the Pan-African congresses organized by people like George Padmore, people like Marcus Garvey, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, and then leading to the attendance of the 1945 famous Manchester Pan-African Congress organized by W.E.B. Du Bois, attended by 4 future presidents of Africa. That's Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Hastings Kamuzu Banda of Malawi, and Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. I think I can pause at that point.
Yes, and you give us a really good background to the discussion. But of course, many of our students have not even heard of Pan-Africanism. So this podcast essentially is to try and educate people of African descent on what Pan-Africanism is. So why don't you just start by kind of defining what it is? Because I think there are several dimensions to this particular
Right. Yeah, that's true. My understanding of Pan-Africanism is a movement that emerges out of a consciousness of blackness, a consciousness of people of African descent. And Pan-Africanism basically plays out in terms of looking at Africa as a continent. And these are consciousness that we see in the writings and the speeches of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, and even our own African leaders like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, among others. It's something that is celebrated into looking at African celebration of its Africa's consciousness as a people, and best expressed by Leopold Sedar Senghor, the first president of Senegal, in his Black consciousness, the Negritude, and other movements. It's also best expressed by Frantz Fanon in looking at African consciousness through self-examination against the colonial oppression and external forces. So it's a movement that it talks about raising consciousness within, among, and within Africans, but at the same time raising a consciousness against the external oppressors, external forces, and so on. So in a sense, Pan-Africanism has 2 parts to it. One part that creates almost a nationalist equation for Africa, and the other part raising self-consciousness for resistance against domination, resistance against oppression, resistance against the externalities to Africa. So I look at it in that sense. And if you look at Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism, it is basically that search for African independence, African autonomy, African liberation from outside influences, and so on. Similarly to Leopold Sedar Senghor's approach to Pan-Africanism.
Yes, because quite often people know that Pan-Africanism as an idea started in the diaspora, but essentially it focuses on Africa as well. And that's why we have African leaders buying into the movement and utilizing some of the ideas to promote independence of Africa. You mentioned Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, and many other leaders, Nyerere, and so on and so forth. So why would you think Pan-African is still relevant today? Why do you think it's relevant to this day?
Yeah, Pan-Africanism is still in vogue. It's still in vogue today, largely as a result of what we see emerging from this African consciousness, that a continent that was dominated by Europeans apart from Ethiopia and Liberia. So we see indigenous aspects of Pan-Africanism in Ethiopia, where Haile Selassie and the whole Ethiopian state was interested in ensuring that Africa was not colonized and dominated by external forces. And that's what you see from Menelik II in the Battle of Adwa of 1896, Ethiopia defeating Italian invasion, was almost a consciousness that it should not have a presence of these external hegemonic forces on the African continent. So we see a very concerted effort by African nationalists led by the imperial order in Ethiopia from Menelik II up to Haile Selassie for ensuring that Africa remained independent and outside the vortex of control of the colonial hegemonic powers that were now already moving around Africa looking for spheres of influence. So I would say that in as much as one is concerned, you can look at indigenous Pan-Africanism from the likes of Haile Selassie, from the likes of William Tolba of Liberia, create that consciousness of having Africa as an independent existence. But we also have now the other side that we see, the diasporic origins of Pan-Africanism, where we see a consciousness, especially among the Black diasporic elements in the Caribbean, in the Americas, many of whom are suffering a lot of domination. So the heightened level emerges in 1804, when we begin to see the rise of Asian Revolution under Toussaint Louverture and other movements such as that. So we begin to see a consciousness among Blackness, especially when Haiti becomes independent in 1804. The first Black country to become independent against French domination, or what one can call external domination for that matter. So we begin to see movements from Caribbean, Central America. We see Latin American movements. We see North American movements, and North American liberation ideas begin to emerge from W.B. Du Bois. Why W.B. Du Bois? Because Du Bois is the first Black person to receive a PhD. When he gets his PhD from Harvard in 1904, it cements this idea that Africa can be independent, that Africa can stand on its own. So that's why he plays a very important role in hosting the Pan-African congresses in Manchester, and which become very successful, and to the point that we see Africa becoming independent, especially Ghana in 1957 is almost an individual honor for W.B. Du Bois. And that's why Ghana gives them a citizenship, and he becomes one of the advisors to President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana when Ghana becomes independent, and that when he dies in 1966, he's actually buried in Ghana. So we see a connection between the diasporic elements within the Black diaspora in the Caribbean, North America, but at the same time, African-born Pan-Africanists. We see this emerging in South Africa when in 1912, the African National Congress is created. When you look at the writings and speeches of the founders of African National Congress in South Africa, they actually have a consciousness of having the entire Africa independent. And that's why in the Song of Liberation, Azania, that Africa shall be free, Azania is the old name for the entire African continent. So they're basically celebrating the entire consciousness within the African sphere and within the African continent. So that when you begin to see that God should free Africa, and which is taken up by South Africa, by Zambia, by Tanzania, is basically a representation of this ideal that Africa should be independent and stand on its own against these Western hegemonic forces. And then secondly, when you begin to see the rise of people like Walter Sisulu, Nelson Mandela, among others, they are raised under consciousness of Chief Albert Luthuli. Chief Albert Luthuli is the presidency of ANC. He is perhaps one of the most successful because he's able to unify the entire African consciousness, not just in South Africa, but in other parts of Africa as well. So people begin to see to identify themselves as Black, as African. And this consciousness becomes very, very important because it will lead eventually to the independence of Africa. Because when the African Union is formed in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, under the guidance of Kwame Nkrumah and Haile Selassie, 7 presidents attend, because at 63, only 7 countries are independent at that time. But you will see a very rapid nationalist movement that leads to the independence of about, I think, 40 countries by 1967, which tells you that the Pan-Africanism aids in this particular nationalist struggle. And that's why I think I celebrate scholars like you who feel, and rightly so, that the young scholars of today are not quite conscious, are not quite conscientized in the Pan-Africanist movement and its achievements, what did and so on. Today, Zambia, will not be free. And even Kenneth Kaunda says this in his book called Zambia Shall Be Free. He says, without Pan-Africanism, without the Black diaspora, Zambia will not have become independent. We see the same thing in Zimbabwe when Robert Mugabe says that the Pan-African spirit that allowed him to marry Sally, a Ghanaian woman from Ghana, to become his wife, raising consciousness among Zimbabweans that they require to be free just like Ghana, and so on. So the whole Pan-African spirit becomes much bigger than even his achievements within the African continent.
Thank you so much for that. A lot of wisdom right there. What are some of the challenges the continent faces today that could be resolved by, consciousness in Pan-Africanism?
Thank you, Professor Nyangweso, for that question. We have many challenges on the African continent. And one of the challenges we face on the African continent is the issue of leadership. I think that's an issue that you have not resolved, quality leadership, because many of the leaders who emerge from the African continent begin off very well. They begin off fantastic ideas with good visions as presidents, but very few of them achieved their visions because they were diverted by selfish interests. And I want to begin by mentioning Kwame Nkrumah, for example, when he becomes president in Ghana in 1957. Ghana becomes the ideal state, and it creates very, very massive strategic engagements with the donors and with the internal resources to make Ghana the best country in the world by creating Akosombo Dam. Akosombo Dam is one of the biggest programs that President Kwame Nkrumah started. And in itself, it created many models across Africa because of its ideal form to create a source of electricity, to create a source of water for the people, even for navigation purposes of transportation, for irrigation, and so on. But Akosombo itself takes a lot of vast amounts of money from the Ghanaian state. And the good thing is that Akosombo got what one can call positive imitations of the African continent, because we see the same thing in Egypt when President Anwar Sadat creates the Aswan High Dam. The same thing happens in Zambia, where Kaunda creates a Kariba Dam project. The same thing happens in Mozambique with the Kaborabosa Dam. In Kenya, Masinga Dam. So the project that Kwame Nkrumah created in Ghana in the 50s at Akosombo Dam is a massive project. Then it creates infrastructure development all the way from Takoradi through Accra to Kumasi, this big highway as part of the Pan-African Highway and so on. We see the same thing in Kenya, Tanzania, and so on, when Nyerere teams up with the Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda to create Tazara, the Tanzania-Zambia railway infrastructure. But the challenge is that many leaders, when they become presidents in the 60s and even the 70s, they forget that they're actually there to deliver development for the people of Africa. They begin to create self-interest, surround themselves with the stooges, surround themselves with the sycophants, who want them to be in power, not because they feel that they are popular, they're doing a good job, but because they want also to have their own preservation in the state. And that's why we see in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah becoming almost autocratic towards the end of his reign in the 60s. He assumes a new name. He becomes now Asseguefo meaning the wise one, the intelligent one. We see the same thing happening in Kenya when Jomo Kenyatta becomes president. These visions are great. Kenya is having a high per capita income, GNP and GDP similar to Hong Kong. similar to Singapore, similar to India, South Korea, and so on. So the country is very stable until Kenyatta becomes Mzee, who cannot be discussed by anybody else. And his cronies like Koinange, Mbi Koinange, James Gichuru, Tom Mboya, they all surround him with ideas of him retaining himself in a position. And as a result of that, he begins to create enemies within the state. He differs with this one Vice President Jaramogi Odinga. He differs with some of his ministers whom he dismisses from the political realm and so on. We see the same thing happening in Zambia. The same thing happening in Tanzania when Nyerere becomes a mwalimu instead of just being a leader the way he was. When he assumes the title of mwalimu in 1967, after 6 years in power, Mwalimu becomes a totally different person. He ceases to become just a regular leader of Tanzania, but he becomes almost like a dictator, taking on his former comrades in the arms, people like Oscar Kambona. Oscar Kambona runs to exile because he has been told that Nyerere wants to kill him. And those who remain actually test the wrath of the president because some are dismissed from their position and so on, and some died in mysterious circumstances. We see the same thing in Tanzania, in Kenya. People like Roland Ngala died in mysterious circumstances. Jemo Kariuki is killed. Tom Mboya is assassinated. Agweng Skodeki is assassinated. They are all dying in mysterious circumstances. You see the same thing in Nigeria. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president, has a great vision for Nigeria. He has this vision of having Nigeria as the greatest country in the world. And he says that Nigeria will be an example even to France, to Britain, and so on. But his experiment comes to an end in 1966 during the military coup that gets him out of power and brings in a General Ironsi, who is overthrown in 1966 coup. And also Kwame Nkrumah is overthrown in the military coup in 1966 also in Ghana. The same thing to Uganda, where Obote and the Kabaka have a very great vision for Uganda, which is called the Pearl of Africa. If you look at the vision of independence, during the independent celebrations, the Kabaka, Mutesa, Edward Mutesa, and Obote form a union. Obote's party, Uganda People's Congress, merges together with the Kabaka Yeka to form a very strong alliance that seeks to promote education, and they are now developing national schools across the country. Because at that time, the colonial system was promoting only few areas among the Baganda by creating Kisubi Girls, by creating King's College Budo, and a few people in the south, like in Tororo, St. Peter's Tororo, and so on. But Kabaka and Obote say that now the entire country will be developed. They build schools in Kitgum in the north, in Apache in the north, in Gulu in the north. They go to the west, the Weyambarara. All those are created as a very strong institutions to foment national development. But what happens? After only a few years of independence, Obote falls out with the Kabaka, and the regime collapses. And we see now gaps falling into place. And these gaps are the ones that Idi Amin takes advantage of to overthrow Obote and institute the worst dictatorship that has ever happened on the African continent. So they begin off very well, but the visions they have fall out of the way as soon as they begin to be drunk with power, because they get absolute power, and you are told that absolute power generates all these dictatorships across the African continent.
Yeah, so you've really highlighted the major challenge in leadership in Africa, and you've given a lot of examples which shows us that this is something that happens across the continent. I'm just wondering if there is any solution to that. As you speak about that, why don't you also talk about this issue of neocolonialism, which seems to be a major challenge in Africa as well, which I guess also speaks to the issue of leadership. It's the leaders who are supposed to steer the ship. And so if they don't steer it well, then it lands the wrong way.
I agree with you absolutely that solutions lie in Africans refocusing their attention to having better structures, because we have institutional problems in Africa. Many of our institutions are weak to hold the democratic principles that are supposed to be in place. Many of African governments don't hold the democratic principles of governance properly. representation by the people, participation by the people, the issue of consultation, the issue of taking into consideration people's aspirations and demands and so on, transparency and accountability. So many of if you look at the 10 principles of democracy, they are not actually observed by the leadership in Africa. And then the other point that is critical that we probably need to focus on is the resource curse. Many countries in Africa, once they get resources, they tend to lose direction. When Angola discovered oil, we saw what happened after President Neto died, and we saw the rise of President Eduardo dos Santos abusing power because of the resources. We saw the same thing happening in Nigeria with the discovery of oil. The oil resources in Nigeria are creating problems. We saw the same thing in DRC Congo. When Patrice Lumumba became prime minister and is the president Kasavubu, the differences that emerged between Patrice Lumumba and his president Joseph Kasavubu was basically about resources. The Belgians interfering, and that's the question you are raising, external interference. So stability in the Congo could not be guaranteed because of external interference. The Belgians were there, the French were there, the Americans were there, and these issues of interest in gold and diamond and so on and other resources created what led to the removal of Patrice Lumumba as prime minister. His overthrow, the UN was concerned about that, and that's why the UN Secretary General arrived on the scene to investigate, to find out what was taking place in the Congo, why there was all these competing interests that were very external. And that's why the plane carrying UN Secretary General Doga Amasjol was fell down in the Congo with suspicion and suspicious eyes directed at the eyes of European and American complicity in this killing. We see the same thing happening in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Zambia. These are conflicts that are very, very external. In Sudan, the collapse of Sudan is basically about oil. When Sudan didn't have oil, it was one of the most stable countries in the African continent. But as soon as they struck oil, we saw what happened. Civil war broke out. The country broke into two, the south and the north. But the stability that was in the north now is in the south over resources. The interests of Riek Machar in South Sudan and the interests of Salva Kiir are basically external. We know that there's Chinese hand, a French hand, an American hand, British hand because of the oil and so on. We see the same thing happen in Uganda. As soon as Uganda struck oil in the northern corner, we've seen now the tensions are rising, rebel activities intensifying in the north. Joseph Kony and his forces in DRC Congo, we've seen the rise of Banyamulenge, these very, very many Mai groups emerging to challenge the control of the government of Kinshasa. And many of these groups we are learning are being sponsored. That Kagame's forces in DRC Congo are not, they are basically representations of external entities in the Congo. The role of South Africa, the role of Zambia, the role of Zimbabwe, the role of Angola in the Congo. All these are proxies for external exigencies that want to have a piece of the pie in the Congo and so on. Many African countries that have resources remain unstable. Why are they unstable? It's because of that resource curse that I've just mentioned. And then thirdly is the ideological problem, ideological compromise coming in, the West coming in with the democratic and capitalist ideals, fighting against socialist inclinations from China, Russia, and so on, fighting on the African continent. So we are also victims of the ideological warfare between the West and the East. And Africa is at the center of all these and so on. Then you have new movements, this globalism that's being poured to Africa through feminist gender tensions that are emerging. We are seeing now LGBT movement taking a center stage in many of the new democracies in Africa and so on. Then you have radicalization by the youth, by Islamic religion, by Christian religion. We are seeing extremism, the right and the left converging to create all these problems on the African continent. So I'll say that there are multiple factors that are creating instability on the African continent, but foremost on this is the issue of leadership, issue of ideology, issue of scarcity of resources, which the people are fighting over, then ideological factors. Then the last point that a member can mention is neocolonialism. Neocolonial interests as articulated by people like Achille Mbembe in his book Post-Colony, where he says that the French interests are alive then in the 60s and now. And you are seeing this happening in Mali, where Mali now has rejected the French presence. Niger has rejected that. Burkina Faso has rejected that. And you are learning for the first time that within 2-3 years of regimes in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, that they are now debt-free. They have never been able to pay the debts, which tells you that many of the regimes that were in present were comprado regimes. These are very compromised regimes that were actually representing the external interests in Africa. We have seen stability in Botswana, stability in South Africa. As soon as external forces were eliminated, we begin to see stability emerging in many of our countries on the African continent. But as long as external forces begin to invade through neocolonial structures, we see instability everywhere. ECOMOG was one of the strongest African regional bodies under ECOWAS when Nigeria was enjoying a semblance of independence. But as soon as you say to see capitalist penetration through oil companies like Shell, BP, British Petroleum, Caltex, California, Texas conglomerate, Shell, BP, Caltex, and I think Total from France, and even ELF from France. Their counter penetration of the African continent stabilized Nigeria. When people like the Ogoni freedom fighter, Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed at the whims of these companies, dictating how regimes are run in Africa under Abacha, under Babangida, and so on. Under Babangida, Abacha, and other dictators in Africa, it was basically Shell, BP, Caltex, and ELF, and Total, which were running Nigeria and all that. So we see the same schemes across Africa, where outside conglomerates control matters of production in Africa and so on. In Kenya, for example, regimes from Kenyatta, from Moi, were controlled by Western conglomerates like Brookbond, like Standard, Acklays, Greenlays, Del Monte. They ran the show in many of African countries and so on. And this tends to affect the autonomy and the independence of many of our countries, because they are running under whims of these neo-colonial schemes and plots.
Yeah, those are very good examples that you've given about colonialism. But there's one thing you just mentioned that I really want to follow through with regard to how to resolve these challenges. The examples you gave of Mali and Burkina Faso, where the leaders are actually standing to these colonial powers, show us that it is possible that if we have good leadership, that Africa can actually gain true independence.
Right, I agree with you. And the other example that is mentioned, but on both sides of good and bad, is Kagame and Rwanda, creating their own economic base away from neo-colonial support and so on. Rwanda, as a state under Kagame, has become very stable. You go to Kigali, and you see a totally different indigenous-based infrastructure development, infrastructure control, and so on, which is based on almost 60% tourism, especially the mountain gorillas and so on. So we are seeing creativity in Rwanda, but there's the other side that are now invading DRC Congo for gold and so on. Rwanda is the now 6th largest producer, export of gold in the world, but Rwanda has no single gold mine. Much of this gold comes from DRC Congo and so on. So on one hand, there are those good examples, but the example of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, that the military coup that brought these Kaki boys, these military leaders into power, has shown that these countries have enough resources. Mali sells at the world, I think, a lot of uranium and also some gold and so on. And these 3 years under military rule have stabilized the country. They have paid all the external debts. The same to Burkina Faso and under the captain who took over 3 years ago. The same to Niger, 2 years now. So there are examples. And even Botswana, when the Botswana kicked out De Beers and Rio Tinto, De Beers and Rio Tinto are the leading producers of uranium, gold, and diamond on the African continent and I think globally. But when Ian Khama, the son to Seretse Khama, came into presidency, he said that I'll not want the gold and diamond from Botswana processed outside Botswana. I want us to produce them in Botswana to have a high value, so that the whatever is taken out is already processed and it should earn high value on the global market. Botswana's currency picked up, the economy be stabilized, the University of Botswana expanded. It's the only country in Africa where university education is free, where primary education, school education, and university education is free. And the Seretse Khama's son, Ian Khama, said that it's possible to have people getting free scholarships. It's the only country which sends students to America fully paid for by their own government. I had a chance to go to school with the many students from Botswana, people like Tirelo Modie, people like, there are very many scholars I encountered in America who are being paid for by the Botswana's government, free by the government. And this has allowed Botswana to thrive as a nation. Today, they are per capita, the Pula. The Pula is now the second strongest currency on the African continent after the Rand. And this has come as a result of indigenous resource mobilization. Botswana is the second largest producer of beef after Brazil in the world. They sell much of the beef to the Middle East. So they are showing that it can be done. Seychelles, Mauritius, thriving on 80% GNP and GDP on tourism, being a destination of tourism and so on. And their per capita income has stabilized for Mauritius and for Seychelles. So the leadership that we are seeing now is showing that it can be done. If Museveni was not a dictator, he has stabilized Uganda to the point that Uganda's current economic state is very, very stable because they're relying on production in agriculture as a result of the peace in the south. If the entire Ugandan state was peaceful without the rebel activities in the north, Uganda would be a very stable country. So the leaders are showing that it can be done. But the challenge is that corruption comes in. Look at Angola under Eduardo dos Santos. Very stable economy based on oil. But as soon as we saw penetration by capitalism, the regime became dictatorial and very oppressive. Look at Namibia. Since independence in 1990, under Samuel Nujoma, under SWAPO, Namibia became very independent, relying only on the production of diamond and uranium. And the University of Namibia, you see the campuses in various areas within Namibia, very, very stable, very similar to Botswana in Francistown and Gaborone. So the leaders are showing that it can be done. But the challenge they are facing is that they begin to get this counter-penetration of capitalism, which actually interferes with the regime operations and therefore creating the structures for exploitation and the state capture, like you have seen in South Africa, very stable under Mandela, very stable under Thabo Mbeki, but under Jacob Zuma, we saw state capture as a result of counter-penetration by these various, what one can call conglomerates, coming into invest, but at the same time now beginning to capture the elites through bribery and other forms of domination and so on. But by the time Ramaphosa came in, the state capture has already taken place. It becomes almost a puppet of these neocolonial forces existing in South Africa today.
I mean, you've really shared a lot in terms of the challenges, but I think you've given us hope that there is a possibility of all these issues being resolved. And so that takes us back to where we started, Pan-Africanism. I think everybody in Africa or everybody of African descent need to really learn about Pan-Africanism so that they can get that motivation to do the right thing for the people. Otherwise, oppression, exploitation continues on the continent and beyond in the diaspora. People of African descent continue to face oppression, discrimination, and all these other issues unless they learn to stand for themselves and stand for the right thing and avoid corruption and all these other distractions that are getting in the way of them achieving their autonomy, their independence. Is there any last words you want to share?
Right. I wanted to share that Africa has produced very many female presidents, but some of the leading democracies in the world, like America, have now produced a female president. So the lessons that they can learn from Africa. Under Sharif Johnson, Liberia became very stable. The per capita income became better, GNP and per capita production became better, and Liberia stabilized. Malawi also had a female president, among many other countries in Africa, which have had female presidents, female prime ministers. So the lessons that Africa also teaching the world, because from the very, very pre-colonial period, there were many African queens who ruled, like very many empresses in Ethiopia, like Taito, Empress Taito, among others. And that there are lessons that people can learn from Africa, especially putting the women ahead, women in the front. And there are many families in Africa headed by women, and there are very many ethnic groups and also clans in Africa that are basically matriarchal, and that matriarchy can work. Many societies like the Kikuyu, and so on, that are matriarchal, have created stability. So there are lessons that we can export to the other parts of the world, that when women head to homes and the societies become stable. But at the same time, that the African resources like the coltan, Africa has 75% of coltan in the world is found in the DRC, parts of Zambia and Namibia. That Africa should be able to manage its resources carefully. The oil, the diamond, the gold, and so on. If you can manage your resources very carefully, Africa can benefit from this. And then secondly, today, Africa's population, 70% are youth. It's the only healthiest population in the world. Asia, the youth are 40%. America, the youth are 50%. Europe, the youth are 60%. So Africa is where the largest population is the youth. So the future of the world belongs to Africa. If Africa can harness its human resource potential carefully, trained and so on, they'll actually help Africa to repatriate some of the capital from the other parts of the world through repatriation of income and so on. So there's a lot that Africa is proud of if they can harness the youth potential and also harness their resources very carefully for their own development.
Yes. So a lot that can be learned right there. And many upcoming scholars don't know this knowledge. So thank you so much for sharing. And I am definitely going to call upon you again for another topic. We've been thinking about the DRC Congo and the conflict that is ongoing. And so that is another long debate. I think we're going to have time for that. And I really would like to get your perspective on that. So
thank you so much, Professor Mayankwesi, for this. Thank you very much for having me on. And thank you for having us a chance to have a discussion on something passionate to me on Pan-Africanism.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button so you never miss an episode.